This man could not believe that the holy sword had pierced his heart, while the warriors believed they had finally defeated the devil. His name was Necromancer Archimand. He realized that the Great Continental War, which had lasted for 10 years, had finally come to an end. It had been a joint operation where the Imperial Army led the vanguard while an elite force infiltrated from behind. Archimand had anticipated such a move and built defensive lines, but in the end he failed. Everything had changed because of one man, the leader of the Northern Night Order, Barkel Rhineland. The man declared that this victory had not been achieved by his power alone. Countless people had bled, suffered, and endured to reach this moment. He urged Archimand to surrender for the peace of the continent. Archimand shouted that those people had stood by and watched while millions died from the plague, and now they dared to speak of peace. He called them worse than dogs, and swore that with his own hands he would kill every knight and every human on the continent. The warriors were shocked that even in such a condition Archimand was still using necromancy. One warrior stated that if they failed to kill him now, the situation would become dangerous. Barkel declared that 20 million people had died from the plague, yet Archimand had used necromancy to turn them into an army. He insisted that this act had become the spark that started the war. Archimand laughed and argued that among those 20 million there must have been people from Barkel's own homeland. He accused him of doing everything out of revenge. The hero remained silent for a moment before raising his sword. He stated that everything had been done for the future of the children. Archimand fell silent, could clearly see the corruption reflected within the hero's eyes, yet at the same time he saw the unwavering gaze of a righteous knight. Finally, Archimand dropped to both knees and prepared to sacrifice himself. However, Barkel lowered the holy sword and unsheathed another blade instead. He asked whether Archimand had any final words. Archimand declared that necromancers did not die easily. In the next moment, his head was severed and fell to the ground. The warriors erupted into cheers, celebrating the defeat of Archimand. The scene changed. Two maids smiled happily as they watched a young master trying to move his mouth. Archimand did not understand where he was. One maid called him by a new name, Klein, while showing him a portrait of his mother and encouraging him to call her mother. The boy attempted to speak. The maids became excited, believing he was trying to talk at such a young age. However, the child suddenly shouted the necromancy incantation of Archimand and called for his undead army. The maids were horrified and could not believe what they had just heard. 15 years passed. The maids became flustered upon seeing the handsome young man. They claimed he looked like a masterpiece created by the gods. Klein had grown into an attractive teenager. They admired his appearance and wondered what the young master had eaten to become so beautiful. Klein merely sighed. Suddenly someone poured water over his head and ordered the evil spirit to leave his body. The man claimed that Klein had shown eyes identical to Archimand's just moments earlier, and because of that several maids had already become enchanted. He insisted that the purification had succeeded just in time. Klein asked whether the man had gone insane, and questioned if he never grew tired of performing meaningless purification rituals for years. The man refused to agree. He explained that Archimand's soul resided within Klein's body, and therefore the evil spirit needed constant purification. Klein denied the accusation immediately, but the man simply sprayed holy water over him again. Klein called him a lunatic and moved away while repeatedly declaring that he was Klein. The man then ordered two others to chase him, and commanded them to prepare a naked bath as punishment for his insolence. Klein never imagined life would become like this. In his previous life he had certainly died the moment his head was cut off. Yet when he opened his eyes again, he found himself inside the body of a baby. To make matters worse, his very first words had been Archimand's necromancy chant. Because of that mistake, everyone treated him as a demon, and once he reached 3 years old, he was locked away inside a monastery. There he met a man who introduced himself as a priest from the Holy Order. His name was Garrison Veerman. From that day onward, Klein's purification began. For 24 hours prayers were chanted around him. Then came garlic baths meant to cleanse him. The rituals continued endlessly. Fire purification followed after that. Klein endured every kind of suffering and torture, all under the name of purification rituals. 5 years slipped by, and Klein now sat on the floor wearing a small celebration hat, though his expression looked anything but festive. Beside him stood his personal maid Erin, who prayed sincerely that the young master would one day uphold the glorious bloodline of heroes belonging to the Rhineland family. Those words only irritated him. Klein pulled the hat from his head and threw it away. Achan immediately looked devastated and quietly mentioned that the hat had been handmade. The moment he heard that, regret appeared on Klein's face and he moved to pick it up. Unfortunately, Erin casually revealed that Priest Garrison had actually made it. Klein froze in place. At that exact moment Garrison Veerman appeared. The priest cheerfully greeted young Master Klein and proudly mentioned how happy he was that the boy had worn the hat he carefully knitted himself. Klein smiled, then ripped it apart. He calmly declared that he would never wear such a thing again. Garrison immediately shouted that Archimand's spirit had surfaced once more. Not long after, another figure arrived. It was Dunkel, captain of the Red Chariot Knight Order. The captain casually asked whether today's purification had finished. He brought up the old rumor claiming Klein was Archiki, and mentioned that the Holy Order had investigated it for more than 10 years without finding anything unusual. Surprisingly, Garrison instantly agreed with Dunkel. The young master realized something painful. The priest ignored everything he said, yet obeyed immediately whenever someone important spoke. Before leaving, the captain suddenly stopped. His expression turned serious. He quietly stated that there was always a tiny possibility hidden behind every impossible rumor. After leaving those words behind, Garrison prepared to depart as well. Before walking away, he reminded Klein about Friday's ritual. The response he received was an angry order to disappear immediately. Once they left, Klein threw himself onto a sofa in frustration. He genuinely could not understand how someone capable of tormenting people still remained part of the clergy. Achon handed him a towel and innocently asked whether he had stopped being Archmond. Klein denied it instantly. He wanted nothing to do with that identity anymore. Inside his heart he understood the truth. Admitting it would only give Garrison more reasons to torture him. Ever since his rebirth, his life had been watched because of that childhood rumor. Even after returning home, the priest remained attached to him like a nightmare. Achon defended Garrison and said he probably had his reasons. Soon her curiosity shifted elsewhere. She asked what an executor was, and whether such a person held high status inside the Holy Order. Dunkel answered. Executor was a title reserved only for the strongest individuals within the order. Very few people could challenge them. Even among the Rhineland family, only the dukes stood at comparable heights. Achon became excited hearing about the family's power, and asked more questions. Klein suddenly interrupted, and demanded to know which duke was truly the strongest. The captain answered that while the 7th duke was remarkable, the 1st duke remained unmatched. Klein agreed immediately. For once his expression became completely serious. He firmly repeated that the 1st duke stood above everyone else. Dunkel fell silent. Achon smiled and mentioned that Klein always stared at the 1st duke's portrait, yet it never looked like admiration. The captain quietly added that nearly 200 years had passed since the family's foundation. Klein looked toward the portraits hanging across the hall. 200 years. He still struggled to accept it. The former necromancer Archimond had truly been reborn. Portraits of the dukes stretched from the 7th to the 2nd. Then came the final one. The 1st duke, Berkel Rhineland. The man who defeated him. Archimond had returned as the descendant of his greatest enemy. He remembered speaking Berkel's name. He remembered the night saying he fought only for the future of children. Suddenly Klein awoke in his bed. He sat upright while catching his breath. It had only been a dream. Yet the memories refused to disappear. Archimond had once surrendered himself to rage, and nearly destroyed the continent. Berkel Rhineland ended that madness. Then 2 centuries passed, and fate placed him inside that very bloodline. Even now he still could not get used to his white hair. At that moment a familiar silhouette appeared outside the room. Garrison. The priest smiled and claimed he heard Klein speaking during sleep. With suspicious eyes he asked whether the young master had been dreaming about his days as the feared necromancer. Klein denied everything and insisted he was merely tired. Unfortunately, Achon suddenly hugged him from behind. The maid excitedly announced that she heard everything. She even copied his sleeping words about destroying the continent. Klein almost died from panic. Before the disaster worsened further, head butler Veerman arrived. He announced that the fencing exhibition would begin soon. Behind him, a dark atmosphere gathered around Garrison. The priest calmly decided that future purification sessions would now happen twice as often. Klein immediately covered Achon's mouth in terror. His screams echoed outside while he protested against the insane punishment. As they walked through the halls, Butler Veerman mentioned the exhibition again. The Duke had personally ordered Klein to participate. The young master looked surprised. His father had never invited him before. When Klein asked why, the butler explained that relatives from branch families had come to visit. That answer instantly ruined his mood. The troublesome relatives had already arrived. One of them mocked him and sarcastically called him Master Archmond. These people were cousins from his father's side. The northern branch occupied one area while eating without restraint. Farther away stood the western branch. Among them, a blonde girl drew attention because of her elegant appearance. Another relative shouted and asked whether Klein had gone deaf. The white-haired boy ignored him completely. The insults continued. They claimed someone like him did not belong within the Rhineland house. He admitted he could barely remember any of their names. To him, the family had already started declining. The fact that distant relatives dared judge the direct heir said enough. The fencing exhibition finally started. 2 fighters entered the arena. The purple-haired swordsman received a blow directly to the head. Instead of retreating, Dalton shouted back and demanded a proper fight. Dylan announced that the match was already over. Dalton immediately rejected that and continued attacking without hesitation. The blonde boy smiled calmly and declared that as long as hope still existed for the family, there would always be a reason to move forward. This young man was Dylan Rhineland. He was Klein's half-brother, and the greatest genius produced by the Rhineland family in recent years. Thanks to his overwhelming talent, the family still preserved its image as a bloodline of master swordsmen. The purple-haired fighter shouted that this attempt would be different before charging again. At that moment, Klein's eyes began shining with a faint violet light. Dalton rushed ahead with a wooden sword in hand, aiming directly for Dellen. The blonde heir moved effortlessly. Wrapped in a yellow aura, he avoided the attack with smooth steps that looked almost unreal. Klein's eyes widened. He could see everything. The movements. The footwork. Dalton grew frustrated and prepared another attack. Meanwhile, Klein noticed the mana flow circulating through the Rhineland house technique. The next instant, Dellen kicked Dalton's wrist. The match ended immediately. With his opponent disarmed, Dellen turned away and calmly stated that he had already warned him about the outcome. The audience erupted. Everyone recognized it instantly. Meteor sword. Klein rubbed his eyes. To him, the display felt less like a victory and more like a message directed toward the branch families. Suddenly someone called his name. The voice belonged to Dellen. His half-brother approached and asked how long Klein had been watching. Dellen admitted that he would have tried harder if he had known his younger brother was present. Klein silently looked at him. Outstanding talent. A beloved heir. He wondered why the relatives had come and suspected they were probably asking for support again. Before he could think further, another person arrived. Heinkel Rhineland, the 7th Duke, father of both boys. Dellen immediately approached him. Klein remained where he stood while quietly observing the man who led the family into which he had been reborn. Heinkel praised Dellen proudly. The Duke believed his son had worked hard to reach that level. To him, Dellen was likely the final pride of the main family. Even Dunkel commented on the young heir's extraordinary ability. Dellen humbly answered that he still had much to learn. Heinkel then repeated the teachings left behind by the first Duke regarding the duty carried by every knight of the house. Dellen accepted those words respectfully. Afterward, the Duke turned toward Klein. The white-haired boy immediately stiffened. Slowly, Heinkel reached out. His hand rested on Klein's head. The Duke quietly stated that he still could not feel mana inside Klein's body. Klein lowered his head. He apologized. Inside his heart, he believed he had become nothing more than excess weight. Dunkel tried defending him. The captain reminded everyone that Klein had spent his childhood trapped inside a monastery. Still, whispers spread. People compared him with Dellen. They spoke about how the second heir possessed no mana. The branch relatives started commenting that the direct heirs were weak. Klein walked away. The insults themselves did not bother him. But then he remembered Berkel Rhineland. He remembered the knight speaking about protecting the future of children. Klein clenched his fist. Frustration burned in his eyes. He silently wondered how the family of the hero who defeated him had fallen so low. As everyone prepared to leave, one relative mocked him again. It was Dalton. He provoked Klein and asked how a young lord from the main line could not even use a sword. The insults continued. Dalton called him a disgrace to the family. Klein looked back, then calmly pointed out that Dalton belonged to a branch family as well. He casually mentioned rumors involving girls. Dalton froze. Klein asked whether money had failed to silence those stories. With one simple movement, Klein threw him straight to the ground. Dalton shouted angrily from below. He insulted Klein again and brought up the mystery surrounding his mother. Klein stopped moving. He slowly turned around. His expression changed completely. The pressure in his eyes alone terrified Dalton. The issue was never his mother. It was the arrogance of the branch families. His violet eyes glowed. He wondered how the descendants of Berkel Rhineland had become people like this. Before things escalated further, Dunkel stepped in. The captain warned Dalton that disrespect toward the direct heir would no longer be tolerated. Dalton clenched his teeth. He could not oppose the commander. Even while leaving, he mocked Klein again and called him a coward hiding behind protection. Dunkel placed his hand on his sword. He was ready if trouble appeared. Klein remained silent. Then an idea formed. He turned toward Dunkel and asked whether he had a spare sword. Night had already fallen. Deep inside the forest, Dunkel handed over a blade. Klein accepted it without explanation. He quietly recalled Dellen's movements. Had the meteor sword really been used like that? He needed confirmation. Dunkel looked worried. To him this attempt was meaningless. Klein had no mana. Without mana, becoming a knight should have been impossible. Using meteor sword should have been even more absurd. But Klein focused. Dellen's footwork remained perfectly engraved in his memory. The angle of the blade, the thrust, the mana flow, every movement, everything remained crystal clear. His eyes glowed purple. He absorbed every detail. Suddenly Dunkel felt something strange. He turned. A dark aura surrounded Klein. The captain stared in disbelief. It should have been impossible. Then Klein swung. Purple energy exploded forward. The attack shattered a nearby rock. His eyes shone brightly while he executed the technique with frightening precision. Wrapped in darkness, he looked completely different. Dunkel stood speechless. He could barely call the young master's name. Klein smiled. Perhaps he truly could use this power. Elsewhere, another purification ritual had already begun. Achan stared in disbelief. Beside her stood Garrison. Klein was once again submerged underwater. The priest happily noted that the young master could now survive more than a minute beneath the surface. Achan looked shocked. Garrison even suggested using an aquarium next time. Klein finally emerged while gasping. He complained that the ritual had lasted longer than usual. Garrison laughed and claimed he had sensed sinister energy. Achan quickly offered Klein a towel. Soon Dunkel arrived carrying a letter. He explained that Dalton had sent it. Klein looked confused at first, then remembered the relative defeated by Delian. The invitation spoke about a hunting competition. Klein narrowed his eyes. To him it was obvious. This was merely an excuse to lure him outside. Dunkel asked whether he planned to accept. Klein smiled. There was no reason to refuse. His gaze shifted toward the sword. Inside his mind he replayed Dellen's technique again and again. That was when he discovered the truth about his new ability. He could perfectly reproduce any technique after seeing it only once. Dunkel could only stare silently. After a long pause, he simply agreed to prepare the carriage. At that moment, Garrison suddenly announced that he would join the trip as well. Klein immediately looked annoyed and asked what exactly the priest was planning this time. Garrison answered with unusual seriousness. For some reason, he had been sensing sinister energy ever since that morning. Soon the carriage departed from the Rhineland estate. The wheels shook constantly as the vehicle traveled through the forest path. Inside, Achan looked absolutely miserable. The non-stop movement left her dizzy. Klein explained that the forest roads were difficult for anyone visiting for the first time. The rest of the journey passed quietly. Klein watched the scenery outside. Dense green forest stretched endlessly. His thoughts drifted 200 years into the past. Back then this land had been covered only by snow and corpses. The place once filled with the dead had become overflowing with life. He quietly admitted that all of it existed because of Berkel Rhineland. Eventually the carriage stopped. Stepping outside, Klein stared at the enormous estate before him. The mansion was extravagant, far more luxurious than expected. This was the famous Cornwell family estate. For a children's hunting competition, the amount of money spent felt absurd. A voice suddenly called him. Dalton approached while leading several hunting dogs. He proudly asked what Klein was staring at. Then he shamelessly bragged that the estate had been built using wealth gained from the main family. One of the dogs suddenly growled at Klein. Klein immediately noticed. He asked when the actual hunt would begin. Dalton grinned. He stretched out a hand and told Klein to watch carefully. Then he released every dog. The competition had already started. Pieces of meat had been scattered across the mountain to lure the animals. Dalton proudly explained that hungry dogs possessed senses far beyond humans. Bow in hand, he followed them. One starving animal reached a piece of bait. Achan arrow flew. The dog cried out. More arrows followed. The animals scattered while whimpering. Dalton laughed. To him, this counted as entertainment. Achan hurried toward Klein. Dalton noticed her immediately. He recognized her as Klein's maid. With a disturbing smile, he placed a hand on her head and announced that she would receive a new job. Then he grabbed her arm. Suddenly another hand seized his wrist. Klein. He warned Dalton to remove his hand immediately, otherwise he would break that wrist himself. Dalton pulled back. He rushed forward while insulting Klein. Then he mounted a horse and challenged Klein to follow. The former necromancer climbed onto another horse. Before leaving, he instructed Dunkel to stay with Achan. He also handed over a magic signal scroll. The commander immediately recognized it. Klein explained that it worked without mana. If Garrison suddenly disappeared, something serious had happened. Dunkel was ordered to activate it immediately. After that, Klein rode away. In the distance, Garrison simply watched in silence. Night slowly covered the sky. Klein rode through the forest. Dalton could not have gone far. Suddenly, he stopped. Dalton sat ahead. Around him lay the bodies of hunting dogs scattered across the ground. The relative calmly greeted him and claimed he had finally arrived. Klein stepped down from his horse. The scene made no sense. Dead animals covered the grass. Dalton smiled. He called it the grand finale of today's competition. Then he drew his sword. His final target was Klein himself. Dalton openly declared that he intended to kill him. Afterward, he would take Klein's head and present it to Dellen as a trophy. Klein looked at him with disappointment. To him, this was pathetic. Dalton suddenly revealed hidden men waiting in the shadows. More figures stepped forward. The ambush had already been prepared. Someone even mocked the fall of the main family. Yet Klein showed no surprise. Dalton continued boasting. Tomorrow people would laugh. They would speak about the death of the second heir who died among hunting dogs. Klein remembered Berkel again. The words about protecting the future of children echoed inside his mind. A small laugh escaped. Dalton frowned. Soon Klein covered his face while laughing uncontrollably. Dalton stared in confusion. Had fear finally broken him? The laughter stopped. Klein slowly raised his head. He called Dalton nothing more than a foolish child who crossed a line. Terror appeared in Dalton's eyes. Klein's gaze turned crimson. He declared that the Rainland family had been built upon his downfall, and now people like Dalton were staining it. Blue energy exploded outward. Dalton panicked. He shouted that it was magic. But Klein possessed no mana. Flames of dark power wrapped around him. The former necromancer calmly revealed the truth. This was not magic. It was dark energy. The hidden men stepped back in fear. Dalton finally understood what those words meant. Klein smiled. Ancient spirits sleeping beneath time answered his call. His body rose into the air. He commanded the dead to awaken. Warriors emerged one after another. The forest filled with undead soldiers waiting for their master's command. The necromancer had returned. Dalton shouted that everything was impossible. His face turned pale, and he screamed the name Archimond while staring at the undead army. Klein simply pointed forward and ordered every soldier to eliminate the enemies without mercy. Deep inside, an old feeling returned to him. He once believed he had forgotten it after all those years. 200 lonely years had passed since his last battle. Endless time spent among darkness, bones, and silence. Yet even now he could hear them. The voices of the dead still called for him. The fallen warriors waited patiently for their master to return. That resonance was something only he understood. Back in the forest, Dalton continued yelling Archimond's name in desperation. Klein smiled and calmly admitted that long ago people had truly called him that. Dalton's men stood frozen. They had always believed Archimond was only a legend from history. One mercenary stared at the skeleton warriors and asked what those monsters were. A skeleton with burning red eyes answered with a terrifying roar. Silence lasted only a moment. Then laughter erupted. The mercenaries mocked the undead. They called them piles of bones and worthless trash. Klein looked genuinely offended. Dalton proudly claimed he had destroyed hundreds of skeletons before. One man even joked about taking a skull home as a souvenir. Dalton raised his hand and ordered everyone to remove the creatures blocking their path. Archers stepped forward while crossbows aimed directly at Klein and his army. The command was given, and countless arrows flew across the sky. Dalton smirked, already imagining victory. His expression immediately froze. The arrows never reached Klein. Skeletons carrying shields had formed a wall around their master. Klein watched with a satisfied smile. 200 years had truly changed the world. Nobody recognized his soldiers anymore. The enemies looked stunned because those shields had not existed before. Klein calmly explained that only ordinary skeletons fought like that. His army was completely different. Dalton lost his words. Klein raised his hand again. The first unit abandoned defensive formation. For a brief moment he remembered Berkel Rhineland. The future protected by that knight had been insulted by people like these. He would crush them himself. The order came. Charge. The skeleton warriors rushed forward with terrifying speed. Dalton nearly screamed. Since when could skeletons move like living soldiers? The undead leaped through the air while letting out frightening cries. Dalton ordered everyone not to panic because they were supposedly normal skeletons. A second later, one mercenary was struck down before he could react. Chaos exploded. The undead overwhelmed the battlefield. Dalton shouted for everyone to hold formation, but Klein already had another command prepared. Movement appeared above. Skeleton archers emerged from the trees. The mercenaries looked up in horror. Another rain of arrows descended. The fleeing men were pierced before escape became possible. Bodies collapsed everywhere, while screams echoed through the darkness. Amid the confusion, a skeleton attacked directly. Dalton shouted that none of this made sense. These monsters were nothing like the skeletons he knew. He ordered everyone to abandon ranged combat and switch to close fighting. Nobody listened. Fear had already won. Suddenly a skeleton grabbed him from behind and struck with his sword. The skeleton's head flew off instantly. Dalton laughed. He knew it. Destroy the head, and victory followed. Then the headless body kicked him away. He crashed into the ground in complete confusion. Klein smiled and reminded him once again that these were not ordinary skeletons. The undead calmly picked up its own head and placed it back. Klein finally revealed why he once conquered the continent. Dalton stared in terror as the skeleton restored itself. The creature roared again while Klein explained that spirits infused with dark energy did not fall easily. One mercenary completely lost his composure. The monsters would not stop advancing no matter what happened. Klein silently observed the battlefield. 11 soldiers. That was his current limit. His child body still restricted him too much. Even so, it was enough. He stepped forward with a smile and asked whether they still wished to continue fighting. Far from the battlefield, laughter echoed beside a luxurious fountain under the quiet night sky of the mansion. Priest Garrison sat beside Aaron while telling stories from the days when Klein lived isolated inside the monastery. The little maid listened with sparkling eyes, imagining every ridiculous scene while the scarred priest calmly watched her reactions. Garrison noticed how much she seemed to care about Klein. Artem immediately confirmed it with excitement. Her cheeks were full from snacks as she proudly listed everything wonderful about her master. Deep inside the forest, Klein casually told the enemies to stop screaming during the massacre. Meanwhile, skeleton warriors cut through mercenaries without mercy. She happily mentioned how Klein always shared cookies with her while enemy bodies continued falling across the battlefield. To Achan, he was the kindest person in the world. Yet in the forest, Klein's face remained cold. Blood and dust covered the aftermath of battle, while another enemy fell beneath dark blades. Dalton watched in horror as his men collapsed one after another. He desperately defended himself, only to freeze when a damaged skeleton slowly regenerated before his eyes. Dalton cursed the monsters. If they would not stop healing, then the answer was obvious. He rushed through the battlefield, ignoring fallen soldiers and broken bodies. Shouting Klein's name, he leaped forward with his sword raised high. Dalton declared that the game ended there because summons disappeared when their master fell. The blade came down. Klein did not move. His eyes glowed purple. He saw everything. The angle, the speed, the timing. Energy flowed around him as he gripped his sword tighter. Then he remembered Dellen Rhineland. The image of his half-brother appeared in his mind. Klein copied every movement perfectly. Dalton's expression shattered. The Rhineland house technique. Meteor sword. The slash cut through the air with incredible precision. Dalton felt the impact instantly. He stumbled backward, unable to understand how someone without mana had become this strong. Klein looked down at him with cold eyes. He quietly warned Dalton that the true punishment had only begun. Heavy breathing echoed through the dark forest. Looking at his fallen cousin, Klein admitted that summons indeed lost power when their master died. Archimonde himself had fallen because of that weakness long ago. Blue energy gathered around his hand. He thought about fate. How ironic it was. The bloodline of his greatest enemy had protected him. The power of Berkel Rhineland's descendants had made him stronger after rebirth. Klein finally accepted it. Now that he belonged to this family, he could no longer ignore corruption inside it. Dalton could not understand any of those words. The next moment, darkness swallowed him. His body collapsed. Klein silently looked down and told Berkel to wait. He promised that he would rebuild this broken house with his own hands. Suddenly, Dalton opened his eyes. Everything around him was black. Iron chains bound his arms and legs. He sat strapped to a strange punishment chair. Panic appeared immediately. A shadow walked forward. The figure announced that the traitor had finally awakened. Revealing himself, the master of that realm introduced it as the world of the fallen created by the great Archimonde. Dalton stared in terror. Was this the afterlife? Klein began listing every cruelty Dalton committed, the animals he tormented for fun, the endless abuse hidden behind the excuse of hunting. He remembered every smile Dalton wore while doing it. Dalton screamed for silence. He demanded release. He threatened, then stopped. The memory returned. Klein's blade. That final strike. He looked at himself. No wounds. Klein calmly explained. Dalton had already fallen. Now only judgment remained. Dalton broke. Fear consumed him. Klein told him to listen carefully. The sounds approaching were revenge. The animals he mistreated had become hungry. Dalton screamed. Pain swallowed him. At last he realized this abyss was built by his own cruelty. Back in reality, his defeated body lay motionless in the forest. Klein stood silently while wind moved through the trees. He put away his sword and prepared to leave before anyone arrived. Around him, the skeleton soldiers slowly vanished into darkness. Klein quietly thanked the fallen spirit that helped him. Alone once more, Klein looked at the ruined battlefield. He remained silent. 200 years of darkness. What purpose waited for the necromancer after 2 centuries of silence? A voice suddenly emerged from the darkness. The stranger admitted he was surprised to find forbidden arts being used in a place like this. Klein immediately turned toward the source and demanded to know who the intruder was and whether everything had been seen. The hooded figure calmly replied that explanations were unnecessary, because Klein would never understand anyway. Green light gathered around the stranger's hand. One after another, more bodies slowly rose from the ground. The moment Klein saw the technique, he recognized it instantly. These were resurrection arts used to control the dead. Realization hit him immediately. The man before him was another necromancer. The stranger admitted Dalton had failed, but the corpses still had value for future plans. Meanwhile, back at the estate, Achan excitedly tried to convince Dunkel to listen to funny stories about Klein. The commander barely reacted. His eyes remained fixed on the magic signal scroll. Something felt wrong. 3 hours had already passed, and an unpleasant feeling continued growing inside him. Finally, Dunkel decided to move, but several guards blocked his path. They insisted that leaving his position would cause trouble, since the competition had not ended. Dunkel narrowed his eyes and immediately noticed the Cornwell crest on their uniforms. Dalton's people. Everything suddenly became clear. The commander warned them not to interfere again. His tone alone was enough to intimidate them. After that he turned toward Achan and explained that the young master had been gone too long. He ordered her to return safely with Garrison. Then another guard spoke. The priest had already disappeared. Everyone froze. Dunkel instantly remembered Garrison mentioning sinister energy earlier. The priest had already moved first. Without wasting another second, the commander mounted his horse and rushed into the forest while holding the signal scroll tightly between his teeth. He was certain something terrible had happened. Deep in the forest, Klein stood alone before a second army of the dead. Klein quickly assessed the situation. His previous battle had consumed nearly all of his dark energy. Summoning again was impossible. The enemy laughed. According to him, the child's body had already reached its limit. He raised his hand. The order came. The undead army charged. Klein only clenched his fist. The enemy truly believed he could finish him like this. Purple light appeared inside Klein's eyes. He quietly informed the necromancer that everything had already gone wrong. Golden light burst outward and illuminated the entire battlefield. The charging corpses continued running without understanding what was happening. The divine protector moved instantly and destroyed the charging monsters with a single strike. Golden light filled its eyes. A prayer followed. Heavenly energy flooded the battlefield and erased the undead. The hooded necromancer screamed as holy power struck him directly. He could not understand what kind of monster possessed such strength. Watching everything, Klein immediately realized who had arrived, the greatest martial force in the world. The newcomer calmly told Klein to relax because he had arrived. Garrison Veerman revealed himself. The priest declared that protecting the young master was now his responsibility. Klein remembered the truth behind men like him. Only 3 living weapons existed within the Holy Order. They carried out the absolute will of the great Pope and alone possessed the right to wield sacred relics left behind by the saint. These treasures were known everywhere as holy armaments. Each wielder possessed enough power to destroy entire fortresses. The enemy necromancer stood frozen. Fear completely consumed him. He demanded the name of that monster again. He introduced himself as the supreme executioner of the church and calmly announced that the enemy's end had arrived. Holy light erupted around him once more. He ordered the sinners to pray and seek forgiveness before charging directly into battle. Corpses shattered beneath every strike while the priest promised to wash away their sins. A massive shockwave swept through the battlefield and erased groups of undead at once. Holding his glowing book, Garrison declared that this was mercy. The enemy necromancer trembled. He could not believe someone of Garrison's level had appeared here. The absurd power erased his entire army without effort. Panic finally won. The dark mage turned around and ran. He cursed his luck and called the situation unfair. Facing someone like Garrison Veerman was no battle. It was a disaster. Suddenly Garrison appeared behind him. The priest grabbed his head with one hand and calmly asked where exactly he thought he was going. Garrison tightened his grip. Pain exploded instantly, and the sorcerer screamed while trying to break free. He quietly explained that the prayer session was not over yet, and told the sinner to be grateful for receiving it. The enemy cried out again as holy power gathered around the priest. Garrison called upon divine light to finish the judgment once and for all. Meanwhile, Klein slowly walked down from the hill after watching the entire battle. The forest had become a ruined field filled with remains and shattered corpses. His expression hardened immediately because those remains did not look normal. At that moment Garrison called his name. Priest moved only a single step. Klein became completely tense. Cold sweat formed on his face because even after 2 lifetimes, that absurd physical strength still felt monstrous. Suddenly, Garrison smiled strangely and explained that he rushed there the moment he sensed dark energy. The priest continued speaking in a calm but threatening voice, mentioning that the aura did not seem to belong to the defeated mage. Klein swallowed hard. If he moved carelessly, this fanatic priest would kill him right there. Fortunately, a familiar voice shattered the tension. Commander Dunkel arrived on horseback while calling for the young master. Klein turned toward him with visible relief, but exhaustion hit at the same moment. His body had already exceeded its limit from using necromancy. Dunkel panicked when he saw Klein covered in dirt, blood, and battle marks. The commander jumped from his moving horse and rushed over just as the boy dropped onto one knee. Holding him tightly, he demanded answers, but Klein weakly told him to stop shouting because his legs had already given out. Trying to understand the situation, Dunkel asked where Dalton was supposed to be. Klein answered calmly and admitted that he ended up taking down his own cousin. To justify it, he revealed that Dalton attacked first and tried to kill him without hesitation. An older noble slammed his hand down and angrily demanded whether everyone truly believed his son attempted assassination. The count insisted Dalton was a knight and accused everyone of trying to ruin their family's honor. A blonde noble then stood up and suggested focusing on the real culprit instead. Official documents were presented and they revealed that Klein never changed his statement during questioning. Worse still, records showed that nearly 20 mercenaries had been sent on the same day. The count immediately turned pale. Inside his mind he cursed his foolish subordinates for leaving evidence behind. Still, he tried resisting. He argued that Klein had never touched a sword in his life, and defeating trained fighters should have been impossible. The nobles started whispering because someone without mana defeating so many enemies sounded absurd. Realizing the attack had failed completely, the count changed strategies. He suddenly questioned Klein himself and brought up the old rumors from childhood. He spoke about the stories of dark entities and mocked the idea of the young master being some reborn monster. Before he could continue, demanded respect for the main family. The furious Count lost control. He accused Klein of hiring assassins. Then silence filled the hall. A voice echoed from above. Klein slowly walked down the stairs while saying he had listened to enough nonsense. He calmly explained that Dalton attacked first, and everything afterward was simple self-defense. He also revealed the appearance of a mysterious enemy who raised the dead, forcing Garrison to step into the battle. The Count panicked and pointed directly at him. Klein only smiled. Then with a cold expression he asked what would happen if the rumors about him were actually true. The old noble froze. Fear spread across his face. Klein's eyes seemed darker, as he declared that he would rebuild the Rainland family with his own hands and would never allow anyone to stand in his way. Right then knocking echoed through the hall. A blonde woman entered. Long golden hair flowed behind her while her presence alone silenced the room. Klein immediately recognized her because he had seen her during the fencing exhibition. Some nobles questioned her appearance, but Heinkel Rhineland calmly explained that he personally allowed her entry. The Grand Duke further revealed that Dalton had already worked alongside the knights before his death. Because of that, the woman had every right to stand in the meeting. She walked forward slowly. Her eyes scanned every corner before finally stopping on Klein. After a short silence, she requested a private conversation with him. Everyone became confused. Heinkel understood the situation and granted permission, only asking them not to take too long. Klein found the whole thing troublesome at first. Then his thoughts changed. This could help him. 3 possibilities appeared in his mind: confirmation, suspicion, or a test. After saying goodbye to Heinkel, Klein followed the mysterious commander. While walking beside her, he made a decision. He would no longer run from any challenge placed before him. Once the doors closed behind them, Klein silently swore that one day every knight would stand on his side. This woman was Lia Wren Paulweavern, eldest daughter of the Paulweavern family, one of the continent's 3 great duchies alongside Rainland. She's the master of spearmanship and knight commander of the Blue Sacred Spear Knights. During a large monster suppression operation in the Western Lands, she once fought alone against an entire horde. Orcs surrounded civilians while chaos spread everywhere. That achievement turned her into a living legend among the knights. Back in the corridor, Leia looked over her shoulder and asked if Klein planned to stay behind forever. He replied that he was already coming, but she immediately told him not to act familiar because they were not truly related. Klein remembered what Heinkel once said. Their connection only existed because of marriage, and there was not a single drop of shared blood between them. Then Leia calmly admitted that she called him out because of personal curiosity. Before Klein could react, she moved. The next moment he found himself pinned against the window while Leia blocked his escape. She calmly asked whether she could touch him. Klein froze completely and wondered if this strange situation was actually happening. Trying to stay calm, he asked what she meant. Leia ignored the question and grabbed his wrist. Her fingers carefully examined his hand while her eyes stayed focused. Smooth skin, no scars, no calluses, nothing that belonged to a swordsman. Klein immediately became nervous because she was not checking the surface anymore. Her fingers moved again. Tendons, muscles, joints. Then she leaned closer and reached her conclusion. Klein had never trained with a sword. Her eyes narrowed as she questioned how someone like him survived and defeated 20 armed men. The answer she reached was simple. He used another power. Klein immediately pushed her away and stepped back. He asked whether she also planned to accuse him of being some dark entity. Leia did not react because she was not searching for answers. She wanted reactions. Realizing silence would only trap him further, Klein decided to gamble. He asked what would happen if he truly was that monster. Leia laughed. She looked at him with an amused smile and declared that someone his size could never be the feared Lord of Darkness. Klein stood there speechless. The former Dark Lord of the continent had just been reduced to short. He even asked whether she misspoke, but Leia calmly offered to repeat it again. Klein gave up. His injuries already hurt enough. Leia walked toward the balcony and looked outside. After a brief silence, she quietly stated that the real Archimond would never accept such humiliation. Back inside the Grand Hall, guards announced the return of the young Lord and Commander Leia. Klein returned to his place and quietly admitted something to himself. For 7 years he had lived as the forgotten second son, hidden away from the world. Now the Count glared at him with open hatred. Klein already understood. Nobody intended to believe him. At that moment Heinkel Rhineland asked what happened during their discussion outside. Klein answered without speaking. He stepped forward, drew a sword and slammed it into the tribunal floor. The impact echoed throughout the hall, and every noble froze. Even Heinkel looked surprised. The Count instinctively stepped back. Klein called his name and declared that he would prove the truth himself. He ordered the old man to stop hiding behind excuses so they could settle everything properly. Then came the challenge. Trial by combat. The hall immediately erupted into whispers. The Count stared at him as if Klein had gone insane. This ancient northern tradition was only used when disputes reached dead ends. No restrictions, no excuses. The winner decided truth. Klein stepped forward again and accused the Count of framing him despite the evidence left behind by Dalton. He reminded everyone about the insults thrown at his mother and demanded an answer because everyone's patience had already reached its limit. The nobles began murmuring excitedly. Then Heinkel intervened. The Grand Duke announced that he would personally oversee the duel. Every piece of evidence gathered so far would be suspended until the battle ended. At first the Count looked confused, but relief quickly appeared on his face. Without evidence, the situation favored him again. The old noble smiled and reminded everyone that Klein had no mana. He proudly announced that one of his strongest knights would represent him and openly threatened the young lord. Klein only smiled. Mockingly, he told the old man to stop talking because the defeated side would never be his. The insult pushed the Count over the edge. He accepted immediately and declared that the duel would happen in 4 days. This was no longer just revenge. It was a message. He would destroy every traitor and restore the glory of the Rhineland family with his own hands. Soon after the tribunal ended, Dellen Rhineland stared at Klein in complete disbelief. He asked whether his brother had completely lost his mind by accepting a trial by combat. He warned that this duel could easily end in death, but Klein only sighed in annoyance and admitted he had already heard that warning countless times. Klein calmly explained that Heinkel Rhineland had already approved everything. Instead of calming down, Dellen became even more frustrated. The talented swordsman immediately offered to fight in his brother's place as the representative of the main family. Klein rejected the proposal without hesitation. He reminded Dellen that the Rhineland family still ruled the north because of 2 people, the Grand Duke and the brilliant successor standing in front of him. Klein explained that risking the true genius of the family in such a battle made no sense. If Dellen entered the duel and something happened, the traitors would gain the perfect legal excuse to remove the future heir. With a serious expression, Klein admitted he understood his brother's frustration, but this fight was something he had to handle himself. Sitting with his arms crossed, he declared that he had no intention of retreating. Dellen suddenly fell silent. His thoughts drifted back years into the past. The memory shifted toward the crib where the newborn rested peacefully under warm light. Looking at that small hand, Dellen once believed he was seeing an angel for the first time. The blonde warrior admitted he never cared that they were only half-brothers. He had waited 7 long years for Klein's return. Suddenly he grabbed Klein's collar with visible emotion written across his face. Klein stayed quiet. Then he noticed it. The former Dark Lord became completely confused. He silently wondered why Dellen was crying so suddenly. Before the conversation could continue, one of the Rhineland guards opened the tribunal doors and called for the young lord. The soldier apologized for interrupting and delivered new information. Count Cornwell had already selected his representative for the duel. Dellen immediately stepped forward and demanded the opponent's name. The answer came quickly. Rondel. The guard's expression turned heavy as he explained that Randall was a former knight who had been excommunicated long ago. His name remained infamous because of countless brutal battles. The man had earned a terrifying reputation throughout the north. The scene shifted toward an isolated tavern. A stuffed lion head hung from the wall while dark red liquor poured into a cup nearby. The guard continued speaking. Randall lost his knighthood because of one thing: his obsession with killing. The next scene revealed complete destruction. Sitting in the middle of that chaos was a giant of a man. Randall lifted an entire barrel and emptied it into his mouth in a savage manner. He admitted it had been a long time since he last heard the desperate screams of a young boy. The next day, Klein's knight Dunkel handed him a sword and explained that it had been forged exactly as requested. However, he warned Klein to be careful, because the moment it clashed with a mana-infused blade, it would immediately shatter. Klein stared at the sword quietly and thought that the time had finally come. Soon afterward, he stood inside the arena. Above the battlefield, Duke Heinkel sat in the noble seats while Count Conwell occupied the place beside him. Count Conwell admitted that he had not expected Duke Heinkel to appear personally. With a smile, he asked whether the Duke was truly fine with this arrangement. According to him, his champion was an imperial knight and would be too overwhelming for Heinkel's manaless son. He suggested that it was not too late to send the first son, Delane, instead. Heinkel remained silent. Meanwhile, Klein looked around the arena and wondered where his opponent was. Suddenly, a huge shadow appeared behind him. It was Randall. The giant raised his hand and grabbed Klein's shoulder. He asked whether he was Lord Klein, and remarked that he looked far younger than expected. Randall continued by mocking Klein's thin arms and wondered what sound his neck would make once it snapped. Before the grip tightened, Klein quickly slipped away. The spectators were stunned that he had escaped so easily. Count Conwell laughed and mocked him, claiming that Klein was already running before the fight had even started. He questioned whether someone like him could truly face a wall such as Randall. Randall stated that Klein looked terrified. However, Klein's thoughts were elsewhere. That massive hand had reminded him of the priest who used to grab his shoulder during the purification rituals. For a brief moment fear had returned without him realizing it. High above the arena, another figure watched them silently. It was Leia. Her knight warned that Lady Hellion would become furious if she learned she was here. Leia dismissed the concern and stated that the woman was not her mother anyway. Inside her mind she boldly thought that if Klein defeated this man, she would reward him with her lips. At the same time she kept staring at Klein because there was something she needed to confirm herself. Back in the arena, Klein covered his nose because of the unpleasant smell. He casually remarked that he had suffered from a stiff neck lately, and warned Randall not to touch his shoulders again. Randall ignored the warning and grabbed him once more. Klein coldly declared that he had already told him not to touch him, and called him a bastard. Then he questioned whether this attitude was the reason the Empire had abandoned him. Randall's expression immediately darkened. In the next instant, a massive punch descended toward Klein's head. Klein calmly unbuttoned his coat. Randall's fist slammed into the ground and shattered the arena floor instantly. Yet when the dust settled, only Klein's blazer remained there. The audience gasped. They were shocked not only by the destructive force but also because Klein had completely vanished. Moments later, Klein appeared behind him. He remarked that the giant had an awful temper. He admitted to himself that a direct confrontation would be difficult. If he received even one hit from that monstrous body, he would be sent flying apart. As much as he hated admitting it, this was not a battle he could take lightly. The children watching nearby whispered among themselves. One remarked that young Master Klein was good at dodging, but questioned how he could ever win. Another added that even a slight hit would probably break every bone in his body. Hearing them, Delane remembered their earlier discussion. Klein had told him not to participate in the trial by combat because it would only give others a legal excuse to kill the Rhineland heir. Delane knew Klein had been right. The fate of their family rested on this battle, so he could not act recklessly. Suddenly Randall charged forward and swung his sword. Klein avoided the strike. Immediately afterward, Klein counterattacked toward the giant's head. Randall caught the sword and slammed him aside. Klein drove his blade into the ground to stop himself. At that very moment, Randall swung downward again, aiming to finish him. Klein blocked it with his sword. Randall mocked him and asked why he was not using necromancy. He questioned whether he was not supposed to be the great Archimond. Klein clenched his teeth. For an instant, a cold thought crossed his mind. He considered using necromancy and ending everything. Suddenly Randall sensed something strange, and stepped back. The audience could not understand why he had retreated. Randall himself was confused. He had definitely seen something. An ominous shadow had appeared around Klein for only a brief moment. Count Conwell shouted insults at Randall, while Duke Heinkel continued watching calmly. Klein smiled and assured everyone that he would not use necromancy. He declared that he was a Rhineland. He explained to himself that this arena existed to prove one's worth through the sword alone. Therefore he could not rely on necromancy. He had to prove himself with his own strength. The crowd suddenly erupted into cheers for Lord Klein. Count Conwell looked shocked as the chanting grew louder. For Randall it was difficult to accept. He convinced himself that the shadow had merely been his imagination. After all, he believed himself superior in strength, stamina, and experience. Mana surged around his body. He reminded himself that Klein possessed no mana at all. True swordsmanship meant pushing mana, muscles, breathing, and blood flow beyond their limits. With full force, Randall rushed forward. His sword descended with overwhelming mana. Klein dodged. Using the faint remnants of his necromantic senses, Klein could clearly perceive every movement, every technique, and even the flow of mana inside Randall's body. Randall attacked again and again. Yet Klein avoided every strike perfectly. Frustration built inside the giant. With a roar he smashed his sword into the ground. The arena cracked apart while dust covered everything. When the smoke cleared, Klein was gone once again. It was as though he had read every trajectory of the sword beforehand. Then Klein suddenly appeared behind him. He calmly stated that a body that large left the back completely exposed. In the next instant, his sword pierced into Randall's back. The spectators froze in shock. The technique looked identical to the one Delane had used during his duel against Dalton. Randall screamed in pain. Nothing made sense to him. Klein possessed no mana, yet he had still landed the blow. Leia's knight asked whether she had seen that attack. Leia remained silent. Her eyes were completely fixed on Klein. And now it's time to complete her promise. Sometime earlier at the Rhineland family mansion, Duke Heinkel admitted that under normal circumstances he would have stepped in himself, but he knew he could not act based on personal emotions. If he entered the duel, the prestige of the Rhineland family would only sink further. The real problem was that their opponent was an imperial knight, and Klein had absolutely no chance of winning in a direct battle. Dunkel asked why the duel had been permitted in the first place. Heinkel explained that Klein had stepped forward to protect the honor of his late mother. Even after being falsely branded as Archimond and imprisoned inside the monastery, the boy had still endured everything alone. Heinkel admitted that he had failed to save him back then, so in the end he no longer had the right to stop him now. Dunkel reassured him and stated that young Master Klein never entered battles he could not win. Back in the present, Duke Heinkel watched the arena and became shocked the moment Klein used the Rhineland family's secret technique. The northern sword family of Rhineland had survived the brutal frozen lands by reducing mana consumption to the absolute minimum. Their swordsmanship focused on endurance and efficiency. Imperial swordsmanship, on the other hand, was pure domination. It overwhelmed opponents by releasing mana explosively all at once. Temperance was different. It focused on striking openings with the smallest possible amount of mana. That was the true essence of Rhineland swordsmanship. Klein continued explaining that it was the ultimate style that drew maximum efficiency from minimum mana. That was why even someone without mana like him could still wield the family technique. He admitted that it lacked overwhelming force, but it was more than enough to bring down a giant like Randall. Randall gritted his teeth. Mana erupted across his body as veins and muscles bulged unnaturally. The entire crowd fell silent in shock. A sinister smile appeared on Count Conwell's face. He recognized the technique immediately. It was the Rhineland secret art, a mana burst that instantly restricted the opponent's movement. Randall shouted that he would be the victor, and charged forward with everything he had. Delane called out to his younger brother. Klein raised his sword to defend himself. At that moment he remembered Dunkel's earlier warning. The sword would shatter the instant it collided with a mana-infused blade. Exactly as predicted, the weapon broke apart. Randall smiled because he believed victory had finally arrived. However, Klein had planned everything. Using the broken half of the blade, he moved into point-blank range and slashed downward. In the next moment, Randall's severed hand crashed onto the arena floor. Duke Heinkel immediately ordered everyone to stop. The duel was over. The audience stared at the battlefield in complete disbelief. Even Dunkel could hardly accept what he had witnessed. As Klein had explained, Rhineland swordsmanship could be performed with minimal mana, but such mastery normally required years of experience. Yet the young master had executed every movement perfectly, from his footwork to the sword trajectory. On top of that, Klein had intentionally allowed his sword to break just so he could attack at close range. No matter how it was viewed, this was a flawless victory. Meanwhile, Randall screamed while clutching his severed arm. Nurses rushed toward him and immediately began casting healing magic. Klein asked whether the hand could be reattached. They denied it and explained that basic healing magic would not be enough. A prosthetic arm would have to be prepared instead. Klein silently thought that after 200 years, healing magic had barely progressed at all. Soon afterward, Duke Heinkel entered the arena and called out to him. He asked why Klein was not trembling after everything that had happened. Klein suddenly panicked internally. He was not Archimonde anymore. He thought he should at least pretend to be frightened. Before he could react, Count Conwell stormed forward. The man could not believe that Randall had lost. He shouted that enormous wealth had been spent to hire that knight. Heinkel reminded him of their agreement. Since the duel had ended, Conwell needed to admit his wrongdoing and fulfill the victor's demand. Conwell refused. He declared that he had lost his son and his exclusive knight already. Suddenly, his body froze. It felt as though his neck had been sliced open. Someone called his full name. The man collapsed to his knees. He could not understand what had happened because he was certain that Klein had just cut through his throat. Klein looked down at him coldly. As the victor of the duel, he ordered Count Conwell to confess his sins before the Master of the North. Then he leaned closer and whispered into the man's ear. He commanded him to kneel and beg for forgiveness, because he would be crushed beneath the weight of his sins and repent forever. The moment those words entered his ears, Conwell felt a massive figure of death looming over him. Escape was impossible. He immediately broke down. He confessed that he had been wrong. He admitted that both he and his son had attempted to harm young Master Klein. He further admitted that he had insulted Grand Duchess Claire. The crowd could not believe it. One of the major pillars of the Branch family had completely collapsed. What Klein had used was called the dead man's voice. It was a soul disturbance technique unique to necromancers, a method that created overwhelming terror in the living by invoking the presence of the dead. Having it whispered directly into his face, it was no surprise Conwell lost his sanity. Klein slowly raised the broken sword toward the sky and called for everyone's attention. He declared himself the challenger of the trial by combat and its rightful victor. He announced that he was the son of Grand Duchess Claire Ladiles and the second son of the North's strongest knight, Duke Heinkel Rhineland. Before everyone present, he finally declared his name. He was Klein Rhineland. The scene then shifted toward a church. Garrison entered quietly. An old man was kneeling before the altar while praying to the god of light. As Garrison approached, he addressed him as Cardinal Muroc. The cardinal asked what had happened, because Garrison's voice sounded unusually grim. Garrison reported that the surveillance target had been attacked. The attackers had been a necromancer and undead creatures. The surveillance target he referred to was Klein. Cardinal Muroc remained calm. He explained that there was no need to worry because everything had been part of the plan. The necromancer had been dispatched together with the Empire. According to him, necromancers naturally spread fear. Those terrified by them would inevitably seek salvation through the Holy Order. More believers meant greater influence. The old man asked whether Garrison understood. If the Holy Order could be revived and God's will spread through only a handful of sacrifices, then the price was acceptable. Suddenly Garrison grabbed him by the neck. Coldly he declared that a servant of the Holy Temple had abandoned faith for political games and had formed alliances with heretics. The old man stumbled and demanded an explanation. Garrison tightened his grip. In the next instant the cardinal's head exploded. At that moment, another man stepped into the room. He calmly asked whether Garrison felt better now. The newcomer remarked that Garrison had killed more clergymen than many necromancers ever had. This man was Archbishop Palama L. He added that the Holy Order truly should learn what kind of darkness Garrison kept hidden inside himself. Garrison stayed silent before asking whether this entire incident had been his doing. Palama immediately denied it. He explained that he had merely brought information regarding the surveillance target. Suddenly, Garrison attacked. Before the strike landed, Palama vanished and reappeared behind him. He explained that necromancy always left traces behind. In his hand was a cross. He stated that it belonged to the necromancer who had been killed earlier and still carried remnants of the magic. One trace belonged to soul-returning arts, the technique used to raise corpses and something the Empire was currently researching. The second trace was different. It resembled the original form of necromancy, one that manipulated souls rather than bodies. Garrison asked what that meant. Palima told him to listen carefully. There had been 2 necromancers at the scene. Then he revealed the truth. The surveillance target, the second son of the Rhineland family, Klein Rhineland, was himself a necromancer. Those words struck Garrison heavily. For the first time, even he struggled to accept the possibility that Klein might truly be a necromancer. The scene shifted toward a mine where an old worker was handling mana stones. He had been focused on his work and failed to notice the presence creeping behind him. By the time he sensed it, it was already too late. A monster suddenly lunged at him. Back at the Rhineland estate, his maid happily celebrated her success. She had finally finished making a doll modeled after young Master Klein's face. Proudly lifting it, she announced that it looked exactly like him. Meanwhile, Klein quietly sat nearby reading a book. It had already been 1 week since the trial by combat. He had defeated Randall using the Rhineland family technique, extracted Count Conwell's confession through the dead man's voice, and publicly declared his existence before all the branch families. Klein had expected people to finally acknowledge him. Unfortunately, reality was different. This 15-year-old body simply could not keep up with everything. Seeing the maid still playing, Klein hurriedly told her that if she had finished, she should return to her room and sleep. She puffed her cheeks and complained that young Master Klein was always mean because he only played by himself. Klein asked what she meant because he was obviously reading. She argued that it was only a novel anyway, so reading still counted as playing. However, appearances were deceiving. The cover looked like an ordinary novel, but inside were pages filled with anatomy sketches, magic circuits, spell structures, and necromantic theories. These were his personal research notes. At the moment, Klein could summon 11 skeletons at most. His control was stable, but the numbers were still far too small for prolonged warfare. More research was necessary. The biggest problem was Garrison. That priest looked fully prepared to exterminate even the smallest possibility of a necromancer existing. He was already suspicious. Klein needed to recover more of his original strength before the priest came searching for him again. The next scene showed Duke Heinkel receiving a report. There had been sightings near the mines. Witnesses claimed undead creatures were appearing. Klein immediately volunteered to go. Inside, he knew that real combat was the best form of research. His father warned him that casualties had already been reported and asked if he would truly be all right. Klein assured him there would be no issue. Secretly, he felt relieved because after the trial by combat, even his father seemed to acknowledge him. If the enemies were undead, they were probably connected to the creatures that attacked him before. However, things did not go as expected. Dunkel had been assigned to accompany him under Duke Heinkel's direct orders. Klein silently cursed his luck because he should have expected this. Dunkel looked upward and remarked that the night sky always appeared beautiful during missions. Klein handed him a meat skewer. Dunkel thanked him and awkwardly stated that he should help with the cooking as well. Klein immediately refused and reminded him that the last time he cooked, the meat had turned into charcoal. Remaining still would help far more. Klein understood something very clearly. Dunkel, despite being a knight commander, was absolutely hopeless at cooking and hunting. Dunkel apologized. Klein simply told him to keep eating because more meat would be prepared. In his previous life he had spent over 10 years escaping elite knight orders. Grilling meat was nothing compared to that. Dunkel stared quietly before speaking again. He admitted that Klein felt different from others his age. He had hidden his sword talent and his spirit during the trial by combat. Sometimes it made him wonder whether Klein was truly Archimond Reborn. Klein immediately warned him never to say those words in front of the priest. Dunkel agreed instantly. He then continued and called Archimond a monster who had turned tens of millions of northerners into undead. The air suddenly changed. A strange pressure swept through the wind. Klein became silent. Coldly, he ordered Dunkel never to mention that topic again. Dunkel could not understand what had happened. Before he could ask further, both of them sensed movement nearby. A village was under attack. The residents were running from undead monsters. Before one creature could strike, Dunkel appeared and cut through it instantly. He called for Klein. Klein calmly moved through the battlefield, cutting down monsters one after another. Then he ordered Dunkel to focus on saving the villagers. Within moments, every undead creature had been destroyed. The villagers thanked them and asked for their identities. Dunkel introduced Klein as the second young master of the Rhineland family. Klein turned away while Dunkel gathered information. For Klein, these creatures were clearly created through reanimation magic. Corpses had been revived and controlled. Just as expected, it was the same technique used in the forest attack. One villager explained that the incident started 2 months earlier, shortly after the Count's family restricted access to the mine. Around that same period, people began disappearing. When he added that the undead had once been villagers themselves, Klein froze. Suddenly a man grabbed Klein by both shoulders and demanded to know whether he truly belonged to the Rhineland family. Dunkel immediately stepped forward and ordered him to calm down. The man broke into tears. He shouted that the villagers had begged for help for 2 entire months without receiving any response. Now only 2 people had finally arrived. Then he pointed toward the corpse Klein had destroyed. That undead had been his father. The old man had done nothing except work endlessly inside the mine. Crying, he demanded to know why they had to suffer, and blamed everything on the Rhineland family. Klein's expression instantly changed. Coldly he ordered the man to be silent. He asked whether any of this was truly his fault. The villager froze. Klein continued that he had not turned their loved ones into undead. If anger needed a target, it should be directed at the real culprit. Dunkel offered to handle the situation, but Klein ignored him. Mana gathered around his hand. Necromantic power spread outward. The souls inside every undead corpse began moving. Klein guided them gently. Immediately, all spirits rose into the sky. They spoke in a strange language. After listening carefully, Klein finally understood everything. One villager recognized the phenomenon immediately. It was soul resonance, an ancient technique used 200 years earlier during the Northern Plague to free the dead. The young man suddenly saw his father's soul among them. The old man smiled peacefully before vanishing into the sky with the others. Sometime later, Klein and Dunkel headed toward the mine. After remaining silent for a long time, Dunkel finally asked what the spirits had said. Klein paused briefly. He explained that the spirits had thanked him for helping them move on. They had also begged him to take revenge. Dunkel did not seem convinced. His mind returned to their earlier conversation when he had wondered if Klein was Archimonde reborn, and Klein had ordered him never to speak of it again. Suddenly Dunkel unsheathed his sword. The blade rose directly to Klein's neck. With serious expression, he demanded to know his real identity.